All right. All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Good afternoon. A somber part of our week here. Coach Bobby Bowden passing away this past Sunday at age 91. And we all knew this was going to happen because a couple of weeks ago at the ACC kickoff, Bud was there, and I got some messages about that he was very sick and all that stuff. So we'll start with Dave. Dave, I know you're down in South Florida. You covered Miami when you were going through college and all that stuff, but you had a chance to talk to Coach Bowden. Do you have any cool stories?
I remember getting to play golf with him at a Seminole outing in Plantation, which is just west of Fort Lauderdale. My news director, this was a radio station job I had, and I believe our station carried FSU games. And he pops into my studio and goes, "Hey, I got a question." Well, your news director asked, what could that possibly be? He goes, "You want to play golf with Bobby Bowden in a couple of days?" And of course, the answer to that was yes. And that was long enough ago where the kind of cell phones we have now didn't exist. If you had a cell phone, you were a one-man electrician. You had to have this thing over your shoulder. I mean, it was incredible. And I used to do sports twice an hour.
Wow.
15 and 45. And so I got in the cart. Coach got in another cart. He was playing with a big-time booster, and I don't remember who I was riding with, but every time 15 and 45 rolled around, he'd put down his club or finish his putt and come over, and we'd chat, do an interview, a quick interview, a couple minutes every time over a 4.5 hour round of golf. And that's just the way he was with the media. And whether I was working a game that he was coaching, or just watching and experiencing those Miami, Florida State games in the 80s, which might have been the best in college football when you consider the talent level that was on the field during that concentrated period. I'll put it this way. I'm a University of Miami graduate.
Right.
We just lost Howard Stellenberger, who was a friend of the Bowdens. I can remember the days when, if you can imagine a Miami, Florida State game, this is when they were both independent, having to be promoted by the coaches donning boxing gloves. In the early 80s, there's a famous photo, you probably all have seen it, of the two of them in with the old poses like the John L. Sullivan pose. And
I saw that.
To promote the game. You don't have to worry about that anymore. But these teams could be 0-10, and it's going to find its way on primetime television. But to see how they built that rivalry and how Bobby built it, as he used to joke, it'll say on my tombstone, well, at least he played Miami. Because that was a period where teams ducked Miami and teams started to duck Florida State.
Right.
So the respect is always going to be there, whether you wanted your team to beat his team or not. If you didn't respect him and appreciate what he meant to the sport, then I don't know what to say about you.
Right, exactly. And I agree with you. And with me, a kid growing up here in Baltimore, I was 9 years old, and I was looking, my brother Will was already a Miami Hurricane fan. I'm like, okay. I'm like, what am I doing here? I'm like, I got to watch something. And so I was watching Bud probably remembers this, the Blockbuster Bowl between Penn State and Florida State.
I was the PA announcer. I was the PA announcer.
Oh, you were? Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting there going, all right, this game's on fuzzy TV. I'm downstairs in my basement, down in Bel Air. And I'm like, okay, well, let's watch this game. And the quarterback for Florida State was Casey Weldon.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was a kid, I loved Joe Montana. I wasn't a Notre Dame guy. I just loved Montana because when I was a kid, he got tackled by Lawrence Taylor and left the game in the playoff game in 1986. And I was crying because my mom goes, "Why are you crying?" I was like, "He got hurt. Why did he get hurt?" And I was a big fan of Montana ever since then. And Casey Weldon reminded me of Montana. So I'm like, all right, let's watch this game. And I just fell in love with Florida State and everything. My mom said right after that game, my room changed. It went from basically a normal room to yellow and red or whatever color. It just overnight, it just changed. My mom goes, yeah, because you were very in love with that colors. And for some apparent reason. And ever since then, I still love the colors. I know we're not doing so well these days, but, I'm hoping we will turn it around. And Miami the same way. I feel bad for my brother too, and you. Miami and Florida State were college football. in the 80s and
in
90s.
that era, yeah,
Yeah.
in the 80s and into the 90s until it started, and even into the early 2000s,
Right.
when Miami was still rolling along and had the national championship, and then the one that either was taken away from them or Ohio State earned, depending on which side you're on. The other thing I remember, another story, my freshman year of college, I was at the University of Florida, where I had a blast, but I had a job offer to get into radio at 18 years old. So I came back to South Florida to take it. But I went to all the Gator football games, and I was an intern for Miami Beach radio station. So I would call in after games and do a short report on whatever the Gators did,
Right.
win, lose, whatever. They were average that year. And Florida State came to town. Now, I didn't really know anything about Florida State football at the time, but going into the mid 70s, there wasn't anything good going on there. They had finished a winless season. They had problems with abusive coaches. There were stories of guys wrestling under chicken wires on mats to try to get, just some nasty, nasty stuff that was going on at Florida State. And this program was at absolute ground -0 if it's possible.
Mm-hmm.
And Bobby Bowden comes in from Morgantown, and I didn't know much about the guy. So I'm sitting in and watching my school get thumped, and I don't remember the score. I think it was 200,000 to 3. All I know is I walked out of that stadium and went to go find a payphone. Again, that's how long ago that was.
Wow.
And I thought, Lee, I don't know anything. I thought Florida State was a girls' school, which, by the way, it was for a while. It was a women's only university for a while.
Right.
But I didn't understand. I said, I don't know who this guy is, this coach, but he's transformed this team. That was mid 70s. And then what happened from there.
Right. Exactly. Well, Bud, let's talk about you. You've been part of Florida State for a very long time. You're telling me at the ACC kickoff, you've been part of them since the late 60s or even earlier.
Well, actually, I became a fan in 1963.
Okay.
And Bobby was a coach there at the time. He was an assistant coach.
Okay.
And I became a fan. My grandparents, I grew up in Toledo, Ohio, but my grandparents lived in Leesburg, Florida, right outside of Leesburg. And that's how I decided to go to school down there. My grandpa used to send me all the clippings and everything. And whenever I could catch anybody on TV, I tried to catch Florida State if I could find clips of their games, because I was a wide receiver in high school. Back when I played wide receiver, you lined up about 2 yards off the tackle. That was considered a wide receiver back in those days. But I tried to model my game after this guy named Fred Blitnikoff that had a decent career. And anyway, so that's how I started with Florida State. But then I first met Coach Bowden, I was thinking about 80 or 81.
Okay.
I had after school, I went back to Toledo, Ohio. Then I went to Midland, Texas, and then I went back down to Florida from Midland. And so I spent a lot of years there, worked game day operations, 84 to 91. I do remember that the old boxing glove thing with Schnellenberger. I remember I was so disappointed being there in 83 when Miami won their national championship, and they beat Florida State like 17-16. That propelled them on, and Florida State wasn't that great that year, but whoever I can't remember the offensive coordinator that year, but he would never throw to the tight end. Tight end was wide open. All we need to do is get the ball down there and kick a field goal, and who knows, it may have been one of the first wide rights if that would have happened.
And it wasn't recorded. Somebody doesn't even know about it. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
But anyway, so then I was down there the next year, and but funny story, like I say, I first met Bobby in 80, 81, somewhere like that. He did the spring tour, which went around the state and did the golf tournaments, and I was involved with the Polk County Seminole Club. At one point, I was moved up to vice president. I was on the board of directors there, and then later became a district chief for the Seminole Boosters. But but I met Bobby that time and introduced myself, and we were at Cypress Gardens, and well, Bud, good to meet you. So the next year he comes back again for the tour, and I played in the golf tournament that day and went to the barbecue that night and got in the meet and greet line because I didn't get a chance to talk to him out at the golf course. Get in the meet and greet line, I walk up, well, Bud, how you doing? I thought, man, this is great. He remembers me from last year.
Nice.
And right behind me, another guy comes up, well, Bud, how you doing? So he called everybody like, Bud.
Hey, I'm Bud. Yeah.
But then later on, of course, working down there, I was around him a lot more. Through my duties at, with the Polk County Club, I actually drove him to several of the golf tournaments. He liked to go out, and when you took him to the golf course, he didn't want to go where everybody else was. I had to drive him. They'd have a golf cart for me where he was out of view of everybody, and then I would drive him out so he could hit some shots before the tournament started because he didn't want to be bothered. So, so that's how that used to work. And I did work the inaugural Blockbuster Bowl down in Miami there, 1990, I believe it was.
That was a big deal when they got, because the opponent was Penn State.
Yes.
And that was really well covered by local media. That was right around the time of the golf tournament or the year of the golf tournament. And I remember that game was as hyped as locally as the Orange Bowl was.
Exactly.
And, it was because of not just obviously Coach Bowden, but Coach Paterno. And it was a gigantic clash for that inaugural game. They never were able to match it and changed some sponsors over time and ended up fading out. But I remember that very clearly, the luncheons and all the press opportunities that were out there, and both coaches met every obligation very cheerfully.
Yeah, that's cool.
Well, I was on the field prior to the game, and I was talking to Coach Bowden, and Paterno came up and started talking, and Bobby said, well, I've got to leave. And I said, Coach, could I ask you a question to Paterno? He just looked at me, shook his head, and walked away and wouldn't even talk. Wow. So therefore, I never cared for Paterno after that episode, Yeah. But yeah, going up, over the years, of course, I did spend a lot of time around. I got to know Ann, and then got to know Tommy back. I was telling Chris, I think it was last week, telling Chris about the story about when I first met Tommy Bowden. Of course, I work with the Music City Bowl, and I've done every Music City Bowl, and I work with both teams, and I had to meet up with Tommy Bowden. Well, my son was in the IT division or department for a citrus company down in Florida, and I'd just been down there for Thanksgiving, and I had gotten a brand new phone, and he loaded all the Seminole Fight songs in my phone. Well, here I am in there trying to meet Tommy, and he's talking on the phone, so I'm speaking to one of the assistant coaches, and I thought my phone was on silent. And he said, well, he'll be done with you in just a minute and all that. And Tommy stands up to shake my hand, and my phone came on. No. And this assistant coach looks at me and says, wrong Bowden. And but then the following year, of course, Florida State came to Nashville for the Music City Bowl. And I got a call about a week before, and they from Florida State, and they said, well, we heard you're going to be working with our team. Could we ask you one more question to do another favor? And I said, not a problem. What do you need? He says, would you be Coach Bowden's personal driver? And of course, it took me about a half a second to say, yes, by all means. And tell you, it was just a great time doing that. I took him back and forth to practices, any other events that they had to do. I would escort he and Miss Ann around to the VIP things that they had to attend. But the day that we had the head coach's press conference down at Nissan Stadium, I drove him down there, and when we got back, we parked, and I walked him up to his suite, and he asked me to come in. And I just thought that he wanted me to stay there for a minute. He was going to ask me if there was anything else that was going on that day. And he came out, he went in the bathroom, came out, he said, "Oh no, I meant come in, sit down, let's talk." And we sat there and talked for an hour and a half, just
Wow.
reminiscing about the old friends and acquaintances from Polk County and people that I'd worked with in sports information that were no longer there, but still tried to stay in touch with and all that. And it was just a great thing. I had promised that several of the assistant coaches' wives that I gave them my phone number and said, just call me or text me and I'll fill you in on the team buses and stuff for tomorrow for the family buses. And my phone was going crazy, but I had left it on silent and I couldn't give up that hour and a half with Coach. I mean, it was just great.
Nice.
So then in 2018, I believe it was September 3rd, that was Willie Taggart's first game. And Coach was there along with Frank Beamer, who had gotten to know Frank very well. And I was out on the field with Coach. He was interviewing everybody, and everybody had phones and microphones and stuff stuck in front of them. And I'm walking off the field, and they were putting Coach into a cart and Miss Ann was there with them. And I walked by, and he motioned me over, and I went to shake his hand. He said, "No, you don't. I don't shake your hand. You get a hug from me." And he gave me a big hug. And so then I walked, I cut through the bottom of the stands. Chris knows how it is there at Tallahassee, and cut through and to go over to the elevator to go up. Well, in the meantime, the cart took him around. So I rode up the elevator with Bobby and Ann. And ESPN grabbed Bobby off at the top of the elevator to take him to the booth. And Miss Ann had just had surgery on her knee. And she asked me if I would escort her over to the AD's booth. And that's what I did. So, I mean, like I say, I've had some experiences with the family.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to Dave. Dave, I know you were down in South Florida with Miami and all that stuff. What was Bobby Bowden like down in South Florida? Did they give him a lot of praises, or was it more like, he's from up there, we don't like him? What was the,
when you have a rivalry, and let's not forget that the entire state of Florida is also Gator country too.
Yeah.
So there was that rivalry, and at the time, and for a while it was a bit one-sided. Florida had some ups and downs until they've gotten to where they're pretty consistent. And so the Florida State game, I think it's the second biggest game on Florida's schedule. I think Georgia is number one. I really, really believe that. But Florida State is a pretty solid number two. But from here, it just depended. I think, as I said, I think there was respect there. Yeah, sure. Hurricane fans are not Florida State people, but there was a deep amount of respect because those games I talked about, if you go back and look at the talent that played in those games, especially in the 80s, when you had the wide rights and all of that, and going through Dennis Erickson and going through, Jimmy Johnson before that, then Dennis Erickson, the importance of those games and the winning streaks. Florida State had a winning streak for a while, and then Miami finally got them around 1999 or 2000. The year they won the national title, they got a late touchdown. Jeremy Shockey, I think, scored it and ended a losing streak, and out of that came a national title. Games in the 90s were, I was broadcasting the game where Florida State thrashed the Miami team that had just gone on probation, something like 47-0.
Really? You did that game? Wow.
I was doing Miami radio at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember the stadium was a mess. It was under construction and there was wood everywhere. And nothing was, the whole experience was kind of funky. And then as expected, because Florida State was rather good that year, there was a thrashing. I always felt that they held back a little bit on that one. Now, Bobby had put up some pretty big scores on people when the occasion arose, but I always felt like they held back a little bit because Miami was so depleted and so young that particular season that, they would go on to have a losing season at 5-6 and miss out on any bowl eligibility. But those games in the 80s are what I remember, either being there or watching them. The ones in Tallahassee, I would watch on television. And there was just a heaviness in the air. There was wherever you were, man, that game had the feel of a heavyweight championship fight. And you'd look out there and you'd see the matchups and you'd see guys that a year or two later were making great plays on Sundays, and guys who ended up in the Pro Football Hall of Fame were playing in these games. And it was a consistent product year after year. And it also was a titanic matchup for the future of the sport for that season. Very often you'd figure out they're out of it now because Miami just beat them or Florida State just beat Miami. And now Miami's, I don't think they can overcome that. It was an unbelievable, I've said it before and I'll happily say it for you again, Chris. I don't think that rivalry in that period was unmatched.
Right.
I think Auburn and Alabama couldn't match it. Ohio State, Michigan couldn't match it. I don't think you could have matched it for what it meant to the sport at the time and how the yearly impact of that game was. Now it has faded. We all know that. And other rivalries have become more important temporarily.
Right.
But yeah, those were unmatchable games.
Yeah. I had a chance to talk to Jimmy Johnson on the Hall of Fame thing a couple of weeks ago. And I asked him about the Florida State Miami rivalry and when he was there. And he goes, man, Bobby Bowden, man, he ran me out of town the first year. He kept throwing reverses, all this stuff.
He was famous for that.
Yeah, Jimmy Johnson had no idea how to stop it. So he actually figured out how to stop it a year later. So he was like, all right, I finally figured out how to do this. Well, years later down the road, Jimmy Johnson was at some function with Bobby Bowden and Barry Switzer. Well, Bobby Bowden walks in it was like an Orange Bowl thing, walks into Barry Switzer and goes, see that son of a bitch over there? Cost me 4 national titles. And he pointed right at Jimmy Johnson. Jimmy goes, I'm sorry, I had better teams.
Well, Jimmy's first year, he didn't. Right. That was the year after Snellenberger won the title and then left for a job that ended up not even happening. And Jimmy's defense that year was bad. They gave up a lot of points. And so I'm not surprised that FSU tricked him because he just didn't have the people that particular year. But over time, I mean, I maintain – I know fans trash talk. That's what they do. But I've always maintained that a real Hurricanes fan has respect for those days and respect for Bobby Bowden. And I certainly do.
Yeah, I got to find out if my brother does because he's a Miami Hurricane fan. And then when I text him, he's like, oh, damn. He was like completely like, wow. Like completely like, I don't think he has lost for words, but I never asked him about Bobby Bowden because, I always fought him with Florida State and Miami in my house, we always trash talk each other at Easter time. And my mother's like, enough, it's Easter. Okay, cut it out.
Well, you kind of touched on it. I mean, look, Tallahassee and Miami particularly. I'm in the Fort Lauderdale area, but still, it's much larger population, much different lifestyles. Tallahassee, we like to joke down here is basically South Georgia, and people in Tallahassee look down and go, "What in the hell is going on down there?" Which, by the way, we say about down here also all the time. But you couldn't ask for more diverse lifestyles and diverse campus life. Although, I'll be honest with you, the campus life of Florida State ain't bad. It's not bad.
Not bad at all.
But it's just different. So you have these differences in the schools, differences in the programs, differences in the populations. So it makes for a really cool rivalry.
Yeah, I want to ask a question to both of you guys. Bobby Bowden back in the early 80s always scheduled he had the Murder Row schedule, Nebraska, go to Colorado or go to Michigan. Do you see a coach in today's football doing that, or you can't do that anymore?
Go ahead, Bud.
Well, I think you really can't do that anymore because with conference schedules and all that. Right. The only team that's really playing a killer schedule like that across the nation is going to be Notre Dame because they're only committed to play like 5 ACC schools. So, of course, they're going to play USC. They're going to try to have Michigan State down there. They'll always play Boston College every year. But Dave, you remember what you were talking about back in the days from the mid 80s on through the 90s and early 2000s. It was usually the winner of the Florida State Miami game that would be playing for a national championship
or a major bowl. The thing that Bowden did, and guys, you're right. They were independent at the time. He just took on all comers, and if he had to go to your building to do it, he would do it. The problem, he got good, and he started winning these games, a lot of them, and all of a sudden, the phone calls dried up, and people weren't quite as willing to come up there. And Jimmy Johnson started doing the same thing. Jimmy said, "Okay, fine. This is working for Bowden. I got to do this because if I win these games." First off, you have to have the faith in your players and your coaches that you are good enough to win these games. You're not just doing it, this isn't like a small school that needs the money and gets a guaranteed check and goes back home with $900,000 in a briefcase and a loss. You're playing these games to win them, not just to cash.
Right.
So that's what built Florida State football. If he doesn't do that, then I'm not sure Florida State becomes what they became. He had to gamble, and he also realized that he had the people to do it with. The closest school I can think of right now that did do this for a while, and now they don't get away with it anymore, was Boise State.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is they were winning. So people were turning them down or offering deals that were untenable. Well, we won't travel up to Idaho, but why don't you come here, or we'll play neutral site games. We'll play you that way.
Right.
It is different. Now, when we start shifting around in a few years, and you're going to be forced to start playing, more quality teams, especially in the SEC, then that might change if we ever go to large conferences with, smaller numbers of conferences with large numbers of teams. But no, because you want to win and keep the alums happy. So you schedule your teams, your weaker teams, 1 or 2, and nobody likes these games. You're always worried about your best players getting hurt, writing a check, all of that. But it's all about getting W's so you look good.
Yeah. I see a similarity, what me watching college football and covering different leagues. In the Colonial Athletic Conference, I think James Madison University is almost just like Florida State, just the way they are. Like, nobody gives them a chance when they face somebody, and I feel like, I know the CAA is not like the SEC or the ACC, but I feel like they could be one of those teams down the road that might be a Florida State down the road in the future that might go, well, we got to become independent because we're going to be playing these teams and we got to go. It's
going to be hard to be independent in the future.
Yeah.
It's going to be real hard.
Yeah.
Notre Dame can do anything it wants, but, BYU is facing a difficult road. I don't know if they can remain independent and be considered a serious threat anymore. So I don't know if you're going to be able to pull that kind of thing off. Now, we're not counting UConn because that's a program that's not at the same level, obviously, as either BYU or Notre Dame. But it's tough to schedule, and it's going to get even harder to schedule now if we end up, in 5 or 6 years with a minimum amount of conferences with a maximum amount of teams.
Right. Do you agree, Bud? I think it's harder to be an independent now because of all the conferences trying to become these super conferences, like we heard at the ACC kickoff.
Oh, most definitely. I could, and what we were talking about there was, Bobby got the reputation of being the road warrior.
Mm-hmm.
I believe he played 5 years in a row at LSU, five times in a row at LSU before LSU ever came to Florida State. Mm-hmm. And I believe Florida State was 4-1 at LSU, which is not an easy place to win. And again, also earlier, Dave, you had mentioned about, the Florida State Miami rivalry, and they played each other every year, but
didn't have to, though. They do, but they didn't have to back then.
They didn't have to back then. But remember, Miami was beating Florida, so Florida decided they didn't want to play Miami anymore.
Right.
They were forced to play Florida State, but they didn't have to play Miami. And after Miami got so good, Florida didn't want any part of them. And
it's a gap. The fans really, and Hurricanes fans hate the Gators. They're okay with Florida State if I had to just give you a choice, but boy, they hate the Gators, and that's why I think they always felt like. Now they occasionally play, and frankly, I wish they played every year. Maybe the coaches don't. But if a fan's perspective, I would love to see Florida Miami play all the time.
Yeah, I think it'd be cool. Well, Dave and Bud, thank you so much for coming this afternoon. I know you guys have a lot of stuff to do, and let's bring in my friend John from West Virginia, John Antonik, who covers West Virginia football. He's out there in West Virginia, and he wrote a nice story about Bobby Bowden and how he was out there in West Virginia. So, John, can you hear us?
I think so. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you. If you want to put the video thing on.
Yeah, I'm going to try to put the video on here. I don't know what happened to it.
It's okay.
How about now? Hold on. Select camera.
Hold on. Hit the select camera part.
Yeah, I'm trying to get that there. We'll get it figured out here.
Okay, that's fine. We can so they can hear you. We got Dave LaMont on from ESPN, and we have Bud Alderman who covers Florida State for action, everything Florida State for action sports, and he does a lot of stuff. And he knew Bobby Bowden really well. So say hello to all of them.
How's everybody doing? Even though you can't see my face here, I don't know. I must have
John.
deactivated something. How's it going?
Good. Well, John, you wrote a nice piece about Bobby Bowden. I was reading online the other day, but people don't realize that he turned another program around before Florida State in West Virginia. What's the feeling like out there in Morgantown after he passed away?
Well, a lot of sadness, and people forget that he was here 10 years. Not only the 6 years he coached here as a head coach, but 4 years as Jim Carlin's offensive coordinator. And Terry played at West Virginia. His son Tommy played at West Virginia, both Morgantown High grads. And his daughter Robin was a head cheerleader for the WVU cheerleading squad. So a lot of deep ties to West Virginia before he moved on to Florida State.
Wow, that's interesting. And people don't realize he was there during the early 70s.
Yeah, he was. And, Jim Carlin, who passed away in 2012, was responsible for bringing Bobby to West Virginia. And the story that I got was that, Bobby was the wide receivers coach at Florida State, Coach Fred Biletnikoff, and was looking for some more responsibility. I think at the time he had the opportunity to go to Auburn and be Shug Jordan's offensive coordinator, or he could have come to West Virginia. And he thought that he had a better pathway to becoming a Division I coach coming to West Virginia and working for Jim Carlin, who promised him that he could have total control of the offense. So that's how it came to be. Carlin ended up being here 4 years and then went to Texas Tech. And Bobby immediately got the job at West Virginia for the 1970 season. And the interesting thing is that Carlin was a very popular coach here. And a lot of people were upset when he left. And when Bobby got here, that kind of placated some of the angst a little bit from the fans. But right off the bat, his first year, he was handed a really good team. And he lost a game up at Pitt that he said was one of the darkest days of his career, even more so, believe it or not, than the wide right games and all those famous games that he had at Florida State, because he was leading that game 35-8 at halftime. Ooh. Sat on the ball and ended up losing the game 36-35. And I think the reason that he felt that it was a dark game was because he was responsible for that loss with the strategy and the way he decided to sit on the ball. And he always said that after that game, he never sat on the ball again. Anybody could accuse him of running up the score. He learned a lesson after that game that he would never sit on the ball. So there was some things in there that he did when he was in the early part of his career that he didn't do again when he was at Florida State. He really learned how to be a coach at West Virginia, I think. And I think the Florida State people would agree with that.
Yeah. I agree with you.
John, didn't he have some issues, though, at times with the fans? And didn't he, in the early 70s when things didn't go well? I know that's a tough crowd sometimes. I've been there a few times. But were there not issues with fans hanging him in effigy and things like that?
Absolutely. Yes, that happened. I mentioned the Pitt game in 1970, which would have been similar to the losing to Miami at Florida State during his heyday. Pitt was kind of always our big rival, just 70 miles up the road. So he loses that game his first year. The team has a good season, but not a great season, one that people expected. A couple years later in 1972, he loses a Peach Bowl game that people thought that, he shouldn't have lost. So these things were kind of adding up and stacking one on top of the other. So by the time the 1974 season comes around, he loses his starting quarterback. He loses his second string quarterback. He's down to a true freshman quarterback, fourth guy on the depth chart. And we have a team that ends up winning 4 games that year. And you're right, he did. He got hung in effigy. They had some signs that were in the windows outside the dormitory, right outside his office. People put for sale signs in his yard. It was really a tough time for him then. And I remember him saying once in some of the press things that he did with us later, that he told his wife, he said, listen, people weren't inviting me to the parties anymore. Wasn't getting, the interactions were beginning to get cool with some of the people that I went with. And he said, listen, if I ever decide to go someplace, we have no qualms about it because of the way people are so fickle. So I think after that, that kind of changed his viewpoint. Ends up having a really good season in 1975, wins a big game at Cal. Wins a big game at SMU. Of course, he wins the backyard brawl and ends up beating NC State in the Peach Bowl. And of course, Florida State calls and he decides to go back to Florida State.
Wow, that's crazy. So, like at the time, like you said, John, at the time, like Dave just said, like it made him like effigy. It's almost like what you see today with coaches. It's like, like you hear, these fan bases are so rabid in their game, in their team. It's like calm down. It's just a game.
It's to his credit, he always came back afterwards, even during his time at Florida State. Whenever there was a speaking function or something like that, anything that had to do with the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, he was going to do that. His wife, I think, was responsible for the Baptist church that was established up on the Mile Ground, which is in a part of the city. So things like that, it didn't really, it didn't impact him. He always came back for functions, had great relationships with a lot of the players. And I think it was kind of a passing of the culture a little bit, maybe. I know here at West Virginia, there were a lot of things that changed after Bowden left. Number one, he was in a dilapidated stadium. And during that time in the mid-'70s, he was instrumental in getting the administration to think about building a new stadium. Eventually, it was done in 1980, and that was a big help to the program here. Obviously, we don't get Don Nehlen if we don't get that stadium. So that was one thing. Another thing that handicapped Bobby here was that they only gave 1-year contracts. So you have one bad year and, anything's shaky. And opponents used that against West Virginia in recruiting, because it was that way not only in football, but in basketball. And, they say, hey, listen, Bowden has a bad year here. You don't want to go there. They may not have him next year. Well, after Bobby left, that's when they restructured contracts here and started offering multiple year contracts. So there were some things that happened after Bobby left that really helped Mountaineer football.
Yeah. Well, John, real quick before I let you go, is West Virginia going to do something special for Bobby this year because of, because he's part of that past that,
we did put him in the Hall of Fame a few years ago, and, only spent 6 years as head coach here, and his record, 42-26, it wasn't nearly what it was at Florida State. And most of what he achieved, of course, he did at Florida State. I'm not aware of anything immediately other than the tribute that the university put out, the video tribute and so forth. But what a great ambassador for college football. And I know there are a lot of sad people in Morgantown that he passed away. And also, too, a lot of those, tough times and ill will that had happened in the 70s. Of course, history has a way of, moving that on, I guess.
Exactly. Well, guys, thanks for coming on today. Any final thoughts? Do you want to pass it on, Dave or Bud?
I've got one little story that I'd like to tell. Jared Moon, who was one of Bobby's linemen back in the late 90s, Jared told a little story. I was just reading what he sent to me, and Jared grew up a University of Georgia fan, and he was planning to go to Georgia, and that's all he wanted to do was go to Georgia. He was from Panama City. And but he decided to go on a recruiting visit to Florida State, and he went over to the Bowden house with his parents, and his parents were talking to Miss Ann, and Jared said he was just walking around the house, and Coach Bowden was coming back late from a practice or whatever, and he said he came in, found him there in the living room, sat down, talked to him, and he said he never once mentioned football at all. He talked about faith, family, and all that. And he said at that point, he was convinced that he was a Florida State Seminole, and he gave up the University of Georgia just because of the fact that he said every other recruiting trip he went on, all the coaches wanted to talk about was football, and Bobby just wanted to talk about faith, family, and getting an education and all that. And he said it sold him. So I just thought that was a great story.
That's cool. Nice.
Well, I'll add one real quick. When Bobby was here as an assistant coach, of course, he came from Birmingham, Alabama, which in the 60s was the worst place in the country to be for race relations. And we had a black football player here named Garrett Ford. And Garrett Ford said that, he was very, and a lot of the black players that we had at West Virginia were Northern blacks from New York City or from Washington, D.C. So they were very conscious of the differences between Southern and Northern and so forth. And of course, West Virginia sits right there along, the Mason-Dixon line, that type of thing. So Garrett was very reserved with Bobby, and Bobby knew he had to win him over because Bobby was the offensive coordinator. So Bobby had invited Garrett over to his house for dinner one night, and Garrett didn't want to go, but Bobby convinced him to go, and they had such a wonderful time. And, here's Bobby. He's got Garrett's bouncing little Terry Bowden on his knee, and he's got Tommy Bowden on another knee. And it turns out that, Garrett and Bobby became so close that when Garrett ended up, his career ended prematurely with an injury, Bobby asked him to come back and be his assistant coach. And Garrett Ford ended up being the first black assistant coach at West University. Bobby Bowden hired him when he had we put his staff together in 1970. So that just gives you a little bit of another flavor of what Bobby Bowden, what type of person he was.
Yeah, that's true. And also he actually helped Marshall after Marshall's problem with the airplane crash.
That's true. Yeah, he knew the Veer, and he invited them up there to look at tape. And actually, he wanted to wear their uniforms. And what he ended up doing for the last game against Maryland was he had a helmet, and they put a green cross on the back of the helmets to honor the Marshall football team.
Wow. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. This has been a very, hope people enjoy this, and hopefully everybody, Bobby Bowden touched everybody. Even Miami fans and people in West Virginia. And, it's great that this guy was part of college football history. And, we lost two great coaches, Helen Stillenberger and Bobby this year. So it's kind of, I guess football needs new coaches.
Appreciate it. Sorry I couldn't get my video.
Oh, it's okay.
Thanks. You never look better, John. You've never.
Yeah, I never look exactly. You can't see what I look like, right? Or how messy my office is.
It's a mystery,
Exactly.
Yeah. Thanks, John. Thanks for coming on.
Appreciate it.
Thanks,
for having
John.
All right. Let me see. All right, guys. Thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Right.
Anytime, Chris.
All right, man.
Yeah.
Have fun and have fun.
Take care, y'all.
Have fun with the Flow Bowling.
Got a women's show tonight, actually, on Bowl TV.
Nice.
So that's easy. Those are just a couple hours. Full bowling's some long days, but this is an easy one tonight.
And you're sitting at home. You don't have to go anywhere.
I'd rather be there.
I know. Everybody wants